I'd like to, of course, thank the NSF and Dale. I've learned so much from Dale over the last 3 years about what might be possible. And yesterday, we had a pretty great day where I learned some more about what might be possible. The Media Lab is a sort of an odd place where usually we show work in progress, demos that break. A lot of you were very brave yesterday to show stuff that was just cutting edge. I noticed the critter cam was, breaking footage. But today I actually won't, I'll be talking about something that is in progress, but I won't be showing new work in progress. So this will take you back a little bit in time. And then hopefully the 2 talks that follow me will be very much what is happening today. So I want to talk about a new project that I'm working on, the Tidmarsh Echo Trust, that's in Manomet, Massachusetts, and something that I'm calling Evolving Nature Stories. My work at MIT over many years was the idea of the evolving story, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means for me. But it's a way that humans understand what's going on around them, whether it's human-centric activity or whether it's natural activity. We all make stories in our minds. We communicate through story. But story doesn't necessarily have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I want to try to make that point today. The challenge for me is kind of wetlands conservation project, which we're starting at Tidmarsh, which is a farm of about 580 acres in Manomet. And can it provide scientists, artists, and the general public with a learning observatory to better understand the idea of sustainability and the natural environment? And of course, I put my MIT hat on, which has been constantly, even though I started as a movie maker, it was constantly, how does this new technology impact this thing that we call a movie? What it is, it will be some sort of public-private partnership. It's a wetlands project that hopefully will combine the fun of being there with appropriate ways of accessing a fragile ecosystem over time and at a distance. It's a restoration and conservation parkland project, so it will be by its nature somewhat public, but also somewhat protected. And I would like personally, because it's my interest, to have science, expression, and learning working together, and with the idea of time-lapse sculpting of data into story form to really inform visitors who are at the site, but also visitors who get to the site remotely. What it draws on but isn't, not going to be a museum of natural history. As many of you know, have scientists who go out in the world, so it has a science component, but it also has a public component in a fixed physical building. Kew Gardens, who we'll hear a little bit about later today, or just right after me, which is a very old, very beautiful garden, which also employs scientists to go out in the world, do things, collect things. More recently, a property sort of maybe not too unlike ours, although I'm not sure how much farming it did. Pensthorpe in England, in Norfolk, has become a focus for bird life and wild habitat. They actually have a portion of Pensthorpe that has birds that are relatively caged in, so you can see these birds up close, and then you can walk through a very large expanse. So there's some similarity to that. The Project Eden in the UK, again, is also a fairly recent project that has a important seed bank that Kew is involved with. It has a lot of environments that are non-natural for the area. And again, it will not be a working farm. And we have grown cranberries for many years, and one of the tricks right now is to transition an environment that has had sand put on it for many years, is not true wetlands in the sense of totally natural. And we're involved in something that will be called restoration, but restoration involves a broad spectrum from trying to bring a land back to what it existed like many hundreds of years ago to something that is just more in balance with what is today, but is still natural. And unfortunately, cranberry land you can't bring back to the original, nor would we probably want it to be, because if we did bring this particular piece of land back to its original state, it would be called the Great Swamp, and we might not want to live around it. Recently, I think of the sort of goal as having it a living observatory. Recently, I had the opportunity to have lunch with the president of Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences. Stephen Brown will be speaking later today, and talk to the president, John Hagan, about what do we mean by sustainability. And I just want to not take his position, but put forward in a very brief framework his position, which is sustainability for us today has to be negotiated among humans. It's not a fixed, specific thing that we can go and we can say that's what it is. We have to get different stakeholders to a table and negotiate how we get the world, the natural environment, to a more sustainable place. And what you'll see when I show you the maps of where we're working on this particular project, it's a very highly developed environment, and humans live there. And one of the reasons why the farm is not sustainable is humans live very close by and make all sorts of assumptions about what the farm is doing to the natural environment. So we can't displace all of those humans. And it's not our purpose to displace those humans, but it is maybe our purpose to allow young people who live there and also live nearby as Boston maybe, or people who visit in the summer, a look at something that is ongoing and where the land is actually changing, and to see whether we can visualize that change in ways that can be interpreted by humans in an important, meaningful way. I want to make a couple of points about stories. I was recently in Georgian Bay with this little 4-year-old, and he said, "Oh, look," he got off the boat, "Oh, look." And this is what he had seen, and probably most humans would have walked right by. And very shortly after, what we saw was that there were hundreds of exoskeletons that had been left behind by these creatures that had come out of them that Steven Spielberg would have been proud of. Discovery and how we see the natural environment is often in a moment where we see something happen, and we can't always see what's happening. The problem for this moment was that none of us could tell this little boy the full cycle of this creature in as near realistic terms as he got to see this moment. And perhaps one could do that one day. One could be able to link in and see what is that whole natural cycle, and why are there so many of those exoskeletons in this very short period of time. It was like 10 minutes. It was really amazing. Another thing we do is we smell, touch, and we tell each other about nature. And I'm just going to, this was a visit I made to Clandeboy in just outside of Belfast. And I'll just show you one of these little clips. Could we have sound?
A great plant. Or, depends where you define plant. A great lichen.
Could we have a little bit more audio?
It can be a pest in lawns. Sometimes it becomes a real lawn pest. It's dog lichen.
It's which one? Dog.
Dog.
Dog, lichen.
Yep.
Why is it called dog? That's just a name.
Peltigeria canina.
Actually, shall I tell you what? It smells a bit like a dog paw.
It
You know,
does.
paw's got this wonderful smell. You smell that. You really smell that closely.
Yeah.
It's like when
It
you
is a
smell
bit like
that
that,
paw,
yeah,
it's,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. And woodland. Smells of the woods.
Yes.
And I'll just show just the very beginning of
So
this
this is
clip.
the smaller relative of the grass that's called the Yorkshire fog. All right, Yorkshire fog. And this is Holcus mollis. Thanks, Jill. And it has particular concentrations of hairs at the nodes. And the way we learned to remember it was that Molly is hairy at the knees.
And Molly means?
Oh, Molly means soft.
So this was a wonderful opportunity for me to go with people who knew a lot, and actually for Lindy Guinness also, to walk through the woods and find out how people actually identified different plants. And I learned lots of things that day. This is also a typical way that you film. You turn the camera, you pick a situation, you turn the camera on, and you capture something. But it only captures a very limited amount of information, sort of a moment in time, a snapshot, and then you have to figure out how to get it to your audience. So the two takeaways from this is that our memory, knowledge, and passion for place begin with the senses and moments in time. We don't necessarily know how those moments evolve into a longer time frame. And the question with the new technologies where we can really track things and capture over time, change over time, is what kinds of stories can we build that are meaningful, and how does the audience dip into those stories? So we're at a time where maybe the human is going to be shaping these stories less exactly, and systems have to help us, and people interacting with the story have to help us shape what they want to get out of the story. I thought I'd mention sort of earlier work that I've done in evolving stories. In 1983 to 1986, I was in New Orleans 32 times to track how the development on the riverfront occurred. This was with one camera person, either me or Richard Leacock, and one sound person. And basically, we tracked 5 stories. When we got very confused about what kind of policy issues were being negotiated, we would stop and interview somebody, but we basically only had maybe 14 interviews in 3 years. Most of it was really looking at how people negotiated change of place. And it was this sort of single point of view was put on a system that allowed students to go in and track the different stories and come up with ideas about how the environment should be handled differently. And I think that that's the important point, that if you can put information out in such a way that people can evolve their own perspective, then when we get to the discussion of sustainability, they will have a perspective that becomes part of the negotiating process, as opposed to a very sharp reaction, no, I don't want to do that, or that doesn't have any meaning for my life, or yes, I'm going to embrace that. None of those emotions really drive us to action. So because they're not really based on understanding, they're based on a very sharp impulse to not to change. And most humans don't want to change. The 2 slides at the bottom, I'm not going to show you this work, but they were with the idea that you could take videos about change. So in one case it was Boston, it was the Artery Project, and in another case it was a portrait of a man, Jerry Wiesner. You can put very short clips into a collection. You can use something called a spreading activation network to allow the system to pick the next thing that might be relevant for you to see. And that works very well. I would say that that algorithm we developed in 94, 95, it's still probably, for my money, the best thing out there for collections that deal with human perspectives on the environment. So not what the animal sees, or not what the water is doing in the ground, but how humans talk about and negotiate change. In 2004, 2005, I worked with a fabulous graduate student, Hyun Lee, who had the idea of doing something totally different. She wanted to do a bench that listened to the world around it and then used algorithms to, when people had a moment of repose, cut that story that was continuously being recorded into a very short little story that they could listen to and have an idea what was that environment like before they had come there. So the idea was you could have a peaceful bench. A bench could be built to hold a lot of technology, hence the design up there. And things could happen around that bench. That bench could listen. It wasn't just listening for human activity, it was listening for trucks and airplanes and dogs and humans. And it could give you a snapshot of how the bench what the bench had sensed that day. Whenever we tell stories, this kind of story, we also have to think about what kinds of interactions the public has in order to access the story. So I just thought I'd mention a few of those. Nature trailer we made in 2004, 2005. You wore a backpack. This was a project in Ireland. The backpack could sense humidity and wind, and the stories that it held were mythic stories that related to what the weather was on your trek. So it was a sort of a lyrical approach to story, but it was really trying to say, let's match the story element that you're getting to your environment. Interface that was made in Hiroshi Ishii's group called Jazz Bottles was later transitioned to Ali Mazalek's Genie in a Bottle. And in that project, you have little corks on the bottles, and you physically open up a bottle, and a single genie comes out. You open up the second bottle, and the two genies are talking to each other. When the single genie is talking, it's talking to you. When you have two bottles open, the genies are talking to each other. And when you have three bottles open, the genies are arguing. So this is a very exact interface where you have a lot of control over what voice you're listening to. We worked with cell phones where stories could be embedded in the environment, and then they could come back to you based on where you were. We have worked on a lot of interfaces where you construct your own story by moving parts. And I don't know, did Sammy Spitzer come in? No, okay. This was a cute interface. I don't know if you can really see it, but we put some sensors in the floor, and we had a big glass window for our lab. And when anybody walked by, the pigeons flew away, but the pigeons always came back, which is what pigeons in the city do. So, very briefly, Tidmarsh Eco Trust. This is Route 3 down from Boston. You see Manomet sort of close to that marker A, toward 3A. You see an area right here called Pine Hills Golf Club, if you see it. It's a very large development. It was a 5,000-acre piece of land that DEC held, and when DEC went under, it was sold. It was going to be either a mall or a large development. Thank goodness it was a large development from my perspective, and not a hardtop, a large hardtop. But it currently is able to build out 2,200 homes. It has its own post box. So we're very close to a place that is really a new village that's just appeared in the last 4 or 5 years. Our property starts with a lake down here, man-made lake. These cranberry bogs here that run through a river that crosses State Road up where it says State Road, and then it wanders back through to this pond called Bartlett Pond, and after Bartlett Pond, which is currently called a dead pond, it exits to White Horse Beach. There's a nuclear power station up to north of it, and there's another pond. Ooh, sorry, can't see it. Fresh pond right here. And actually, nobody thinks that Fresh Pond is connected to the bogs, but actually what our farmer says is that the heron used to run up to Fresh Pond. So Fresh Pond probably runs down and crosses the bogs down and then exits to the sea the same way. The total drop of that acreage is 12 feet from the top to the bottom. The cranberry bogs have been in production since the 1920s easily. They were, by the way, all handmade, donkeys and humans took giant rocks out. It was a huge effort, and when I look at it, part of me goes like, that was a huge human effort. What are you doing putting that into preservation? The easement that we are currently working to put on the land is from the top of the pond all the way through the wetlands, the swampland on the other side, right to 3A. The bogs on the other side, which are also ours, and contain a piece of land that goes up through the Pine Hills property, will continue to be farmed for the moment, but will probably change ownership. So it's a large area. We're just dealing right now with the wetlands. There's uplands on either side that we also have to think about that obviously impact the wetlands. And this partnership is with NRCS, which is part of the USDA. So what can you do on a property like that? I mean, it's invisible. Once it goes into conservation, you can't walk on it. One entity that thought about purchasing it wanted to drain the man-made pond, which would bring that pond down for everybody who lives around it. Might be good, might not be good, but it won't hold the water table up. We don't know. Science has to be the people and the activity that we look to try to figure out what's best. But in the meantime, it is a beautiful spot where lots of natural things occur. And Dale's Owl Project brought me to this wonderful idea of, what people see on the property could be maybe monitored by cameras and by his sensors that take sound, humidity, temperature, pressure, so that we could really see what happens as we take this property through a set of changes. We could see it in a way that it's probably never been seen before on a daily basis. And what we have to figure out is how to do these time-lapse intervals and what can humans engage with, what's useful for humans to engage with. For instance, if we put wide cameras there, humans might want to look at a particular activity. And so they might want to control the cameras. I have the idea that you might have a periscope able to look down into the water as a visitor. So these projects can be made up of multiple projects, and each project needs to think about what to sense, weather, water, animals, insects. I'd love to do insect sensing with Dale's sensors. What are the technologies for sensing? What kind of human control and annotation do we want? And how is the experience going to be sensed? Is it going to be in an environment, let's say we're going to navigate a sound space. Do we want to do that in a separate environment? Maybe someplace else in Manomet, or maybe in Boston, whatever. Or do we want to do that, can we do that in some way on the web? Or can we do that with smartphones? What are the roles of social network aspects? And so part of the mission of the Echo Trust will be to attract the scientists, artists, and educators who want to work with us to shape this. I have just a list of very brief first projects. One might be the shaping of the visualization using cameras. By the way, there's some beautiful work in visualization we'll see later today by Fernanda Viega, where people can define the point of view and the synchronicity of the cameras. Navigating a soundscape, I want to do obviously with Dale. We want to figure out how in these projects visitors who are just walking the bog can contribute their sightings of wildlife. And then we would want to do, I think, something like what we did with those Q scientists at Clandeboye, which is to get people who are really deeply engaged in this environment to talk to us about what they see. So collaborators so far are Tidmarsh Farms, which is held by 3 of my husband's children. Hyun Lee, who's at BU. Dale, continue to collaborate with USDA. We're talking to several future collaborators, and I probably overran my time by a little bit, even though I told you it would be very short. But anyway, what we're hoping for is that any of you, that have suggestions of what might be interesting to do that is both strong in how people can learn about the natural environment and how people participate in the project, suggest to us ideas that you have that you think might be really interesting in terms of monitoring and creating an evolving story of change for a property that is just going into conservation now. So.